this episode, we are going to talk about the great human tragedy which accompanied the independence of India and also the partition of the country. As you know that the history of the partition has been studied by historians from different perspectives. Long-term causes or short-term happenings which contributed to the inevitability of the territorial surgery. One can trace back the history of partition to the communal conflict that had started sometime around the 1890s as a consequence of the conflict between the Muslim and the Hindu political elites for power. One can perhaps concentrate also on the decade of the 1940s after the announcement of the partition demand by the Muslim League in 1940. Recently, the historians are concentrating on the human tragedy that I was talking about. At the moment of independence, when Pandit Nehru in the Constituent Assembly was making his famous tryst with destiny speech at the stroke of that midnight hour, thousands of people were actually leaving Punjab on the West Punjab villages and East Bengal villages for a new home in independent India. The history of such homeless refugees has begun to be written by scholars by using extensively the literature that has been written on the event later during the 1960s and 70s, both in Bengal and the Punjab.
So, are there any differences in the literature of the Punjab and the West Bengal?
Of course, there are differences, and such differences are to some extent linked with the experience of migration itself. If you look at Punjab, there are of course common elements, because you know that throughout the decade of the 1940s, especially after the announcement of the direct action program by the Muslim League in 1946, life became insecure. You have the gruesome Noakhali riots in Eastern Bengal, you have similar such riots in the Punjab countryside as well. We have instances of how rural people in the Punjab countryside were leaving their homes and taking shelter in towns like Rawalpindi or Lahore. So, riot and the fear that was generated by communal frenzy had already started pushing people to migrate from their homes, but before the decision was taken to partition the country, nobody thought that this was a kind of a permanent fate that was awaiting them. People wished to go back to their villages, and even if there were riot-torn areas in Eastern Bengal, there was no inkling that the partition was going to create this kind of a tragedy for which people would have to leave their home for an entirely new destination. Now, to talk about the literature, if you look at the North Indian literature from both sides of the border, the Punjabi literature, because there are Muslims who migrated to West Pakistan and wrote about how badly they felt in leaving their country. The North Indian Muslim intellectual elites, the great poets, the writers, the novelists, who had written down their own experiences of the partition in the form of autobiographies or fictions. You have similar such literature for Bengal as well. But if you look at the North Indian literature, there is a certain admission of the brutality of the event. I mean, think of Bhisma Sahani's Tamas, and which has been turned into a very significant television serial. You can see the brutality. This kind of admission of brutality or the acceptance of brutality is somewhat missing in the Eastern Indian, particularly Bengali literature. Bengali literature is more influenced by a certain nostalgia about the lost land, to which many of the writers apparently wish to return. Take, for example, the case of Sunil Ganguly. Sunil Ganguly has written on